Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves, and today I'm one third of what we hope will be the first podcast in a series that asks the questions, is an alternative Ireland possible? Remember folks, the Echo Chamber podcast is a free-flowing conversation that may occasionally touch on mature subjects. As always, I'm joined by my co-host Martin McMahon. Hi Martin, how are you?
How you doing, Tony? How are you?
More importantly, we're delighted to be joined in the Tortoise Shack by Rory Hearne. Rory, among his many strings in his bow, academic, author, political analyst, activist, is also a constant thorn in the side of people who like to say, it's not that simple and sure we are where we are. Basically, he's the guy in the room who knows there are solutions and it's actually just a lack of implementation that's holding us back. Rory, thanks for coming on the pod.
How are you doing, guys?
Listen, I do want to get into it almost straight away, but I also want to acknowledge the fact that a Garda was shot just up the road this morning in Ballymun.
That's right.
And it's you know, these are people who are here to protect and serve, and to use the US and the US phraseology. But it's a dreadful thing, and we do hope that he makes a full recovery.
We're all pulling here. We hope this time of the year, that's a dreadful thing for any family. So we're just hoping that everything's all right there. In other news, and I just have to mention this, Irish Examiner today, spot on. Yesterday, Leo stood up in the Dáil and he said that he was pretty sure there was no more documentation that was withheld from the tribunal. And I was listening to it live, and I straight away on Twitter, what does he mean pretty sure? Why not definite? And then the Examiner this morning has the story that there may well be emails between the minister or the ex-minister and her advisors that haven't been submitted to the tribunal. Now, Leo went out on a limb to defend the minister over this issue, and that is his want as a party leader. But there are other occasions, Rory, and you've been subject of this, where Leo goes on the attack. Isn't that right?
That's very true, Martin. Yes, I was the subject of one of his attacks or his diatribes in the Dáil in July of this year, when myself and my colleague from Maynooth produced a report which was looking into the homelessness crisis, and in particular the impact of these new family hubs that have been developed as a form of emergency accommodation for homeless families. And the government were claiming that these were a better form of accommodation than the hotels, and to a certain extent they are, because families that are been forced to have no homes or homeless are put into commercial hotels. Often the hotels can turn around at very short notice and say you have to get out. They're put out in the street again, whereas the hubs are these kind of emergency accommodation where you have 40-50 families together in a place. Some of them are former Magdalene Laundries.
I know,
the connotation of that,
it's awful.
We're like what we do to poor people in this country, re-institutionalizing them, the poor,
and paying rent to some of the ministries.
In terms of paying where the rent is going, in terms of who's making the money from that emergency accommodation, some of the biggest hotel blocks. But anyway, our report found that actually the hubs, that spending time in these hubs really damaged the children, in particular, damaged the families, because they are effectively institutions. You know what I mean? It's not a home. You've got 20-30 families who don't know each other, stuck together, and we found it damaging. And of course it was asked in the Dáil, the Taoiseach was asked about this report, and it was a sort of indicator of what's kind of happened. I suppose we've seen it in the last 3 weeks, this attack on the idea of the housing crisis being, and homelessness being, a crisis, that actually this idea of them trying to normalise it and attack those who are critiquing it. He got up and he said, rather than actually addressing the report, he started talking about me and saying, oh, I know that fella Rory Hearne, he used to be president when I was student union president when I was in Trinity, and he was a year below me in Trinity. Don't remember him.
He was that memorable.
He was that memorable then, and unfortunately he's too memorable now. But he referred then to a thing in the Phoenix Park where we both had a run together, doing one of these runs, and he said I used impolite language that wasn't of an academic. And it was a strange comment, because I tried to remember what the hell happened. And I remember I was at a run and I saw him, and he was standing getting ready. I went up to him, it was probably 2013, I'd say, and I was working as a community worker in Dolphins Barn, one of the inner city communities devastated by the crash and austerity and the cuts. And I didn't have a lot of access to politicians at times, so I went, well, here's a guy, I'm going to let him, know. So I went up to him,
you do.
And I didn't punch him, I didn't curse at him. I said, you know what, you should be ashamed of yourself. I said, you promised to burn bondholders. Child poverty is doubling. You're an absolute disgrace. What you're doing to people in this country. And he just went, oh, we're doing this. He just sort of mumbled to himself, and I walked away, and that was it.
You see, Donald Trump and Leo have this little thing in common. They never forget a slight. They never, ever forget a slight.
But isn't it incredible to take that so personally and not to be able to, to turn around. But as I said, I don't think that was an accident or just a personal thing. I actually think it was part of a strategy that they were developing, which was try to undermine.
Make sure it's gone back to Cicero. If you've no basis for an argument, attack the plaintiff, and that way you may actually just distract and so that's clearly what's happening, and it's become a tactic that's been used by Damien English, by people within the actual
the head of the housing agency, Conor Skean, said it as well. The housing crisis is normal. We had Eileen Gleeson from Dublin City Council talk about it was people's past bad behaviour that caused homelessness,
and that line was echoed just yesterday on RTE Drive Time. A lady died in Cork, and RTE Drive Time had to say that she had problems.
Yeah.
And I took exception again in a tweet to Twitter. This is a woman who has died on the street at Christmas. That's her major problem.
Yeah.
We all have problems to lesser or greater degrees. Homelessness isn't something you earn or deserve. Homelessness is when the system has failed you so many times along the way.
Absolutely, and I think it's really important, to say this, that the majority of people who are becoming homeless from the private rental sector, because they've been evicted by landlords, they can't afford to pay the rent, and because there is no social housing. And on top of that, the homelessness crisis is only the tip of the iceberg. The housing crisis is affected, like I've done the figures, at least 250,000 households are in some form. 250,000 households are in some form of housing distress. And the problem is, part of the problem has been, I think, that, not a problem, but obviously homelessness has been the issue. But the housing crisis is so wide now, and I think the government is terrified that people will start to join the dots. There's a huge sympathy out there for homelessness. People don't want it. They feel it's a stain on Irish society. It's wrong. So the government is trying to blame the people themselves. And of course there's mental health issues. Like, why anybody who's going through that level of poverty, that level of trauma...
We had Hazel Larkin in here last week, and she said that if she was on the street for more than a couple of days, she'd gladly put whatever into her veins.
Absolutely. You have people going into emergency accommodation, they're going in clean, they're coming out, being drug addicted. How could anybody go through that trauma and not be affected by it?
But Fine Gael see housing the homeless as a moral hazard. And that's the bottom line for them. There's a moral hazard in giving somebody something for nothing. And that's how they see it. Even though everybody who's in social housing must pay for that social housing, it generates revenue. In fact, it pays for itself over the longer the term, it pays for itself.
I think that's what we want to move this conversation on to. What are the solutions for tackling the housing crisis? There is a huge... The first thing I'd like to say is that the big problem I have is that we don't even acknowledge the issue, because we talk about 3,500 units built when actually the Department's housing statistics say, well, they built 77 in the first 6 months of this year. How can you, if we don't actually acknowledge where we are, how do you actually fix it? Rory, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's a number of the figures are thrown out all the time, and they can be very confusing, but to put it really simply, on the private sector supply side, the Mel Reynolds and Lorcan Sir have done really good research into this. They have shown that in actual fact the claim that they're building 18,000 private units a year, I can't remember if it's 15 or 18,000, is nonsense. That in actual fact that's down to what they call ESB connections. So a vacant property that's reconnected to ESB is counted as a new unit. In actual fact, they're saying there's probably only about 6,000 units been built every year in the private sector. The demand is roughly, they reckon they need about 30,000 private units been built every year. That's the private sector. So you've really much less supply taking place and no prospect of supply. The only private housing that's going to be built in the coming years is people who are able to pay 400, 500, 600,000. There is no affordable housing going to be built by the private sector in the coming years.
No.
The other thing then, in terms of the state, so this is social local authority housing, the government has been putting on these figures, like they say, we provided 18,000 social housing units last year. No, you didn't. You built 600. So where does the 18,000 figure come from? It's all the private rental sector.
Yeah.
They've created this new, it's a marketized provision of social housing where low-income families are given a subsidy, and which all goes to landlords.
Yeah.
We now have almost over $500 million a year going to private landlords. We talk about, corporate welfare, welfare going to the poor. This is the biggest welfare transfer to the already wealthy in a lot of cases. But the government is not building social housing in any scale. The numbers are very, very small. So the solutions are, it has to be an acceptance that the private market will not build affordable housing. It will not provide social housing. Particularly in Ireland, the private development system is bust. So the state has to do it, and there's many ways it can do it. Local authorities could be do it if they were given the proper funding. They could build 10,000 social housing units a year. No reason why not. And we had in the budget, they put $1 billion into a rainy day fund. $1 billion into a rainy day fund. As I say, I stop myself cursing now, but there's a bloody flood.
You're allowed to curse.
There's a fucking flood, a tsunami of homelessness, housing crisis going on, and we're putting $1 billion off into a rainy day fund.
They also put the $3 billion from the bank sale straight off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, from the AIB, the money was there. Obviously, we've the Apple money potentially is there if we put in a wealth tax. So if we didn't give away tax cuts, which are going to the majority higher income earners, so the money is there. If they put it into local authorities, they could build. I think the other option is there's this idea of a cost rental housing model. I don't know if you've heard of this.
I have.
So Denmark and Austria do this. They provide state not-for-profit rental housing to anybody on any income, and that's where we need to move to. There has to be a recognition that guards, nurses, teachers, workers who are on the average wage can't afford housing now. They can't afford the rent. They can't afford to buy. So who's going to provide them housing? And this is where the not-for-profit, the state sector, semi-state has to just go out and build. And I think we need a national housing agency to be set up to go support local authorities to build, support the cooperatives like in Ballymun, the O'Coolan Cooperative, support building affordable purchase, affordable rent. But what that requires is a willingness of the political system to stand up to what I call is, I know you're probably familiar with, Noam Chomsky talked about the military industrial complex that governed American policy, because basically they wanted wars. Yes. And why did they want wars? They wanted wars because the arms that they would produce, and and obviously oil, and there was this complex.
The Halliburton and the
we're back to the shock doctrine here.
Yes. Who was benefiting from the policy? And the thing is that I would describe, we have a property financial complex in Ireland, a property finance complex, who are all the people who benefit from the current policies. The big investors, the very wealthy landlords, the banks, they all benefit from it, and they're the ones who are dictating policy. So that's who the government has to stand up to.
And I say this
to change policy.
I say this quite a lot. The two biggest lobbyists that access government are IBEC and the Construction Federation Industry, 1 and 2. And
you could add, I think more recently, the financial industry, the financial investment.
Oh, well, they have a seat at the table, permanently have a seat at the table. I mean, they go over, there's that committee group that, they're at the table constantly.
Who's now one of the second biggest landlords in this country, who is Kennedy Wilson, a US company that came in here, bought up toxic loans and property. Kennedy Wilson were lobbying the government to stop them putting in place rent controls in 2014, 2015, when rents were increasing significantly. The government should have stepped in, put in place rent controls. They didn't, because they were being lobbied by the big financial investors, the vultures who came in here, and that's who the government has been making policy for.
They're almost they're hand in glove with the Construction Industry Federation, because if Tom Parlin arrives on something and he's asked about the future of the private rental thing, he actually bigs up Kennedy Wilson and I won't even go in and name any other names, but he bigs them up as these are the landlords of the future.
Yeah, the real estate investment trusts, the IRES,
the REITs, and that these are going to be these are actually being bandied about as the solutions.
Yeah.
I always talk about rent-seeking markets. This is a rent-seeking market, and we have a government that is actually in effect a client of these things. But if we could, I suppose the difference being that we can sit around here and we can accept that. But what we have to be able to do is show people, because the answer we get thrown back, you made a comment saying you can't build 10,000 houses, social houses in a year. And the answer has to be, well, we did it in 86.
Absolutely. I was speaking at a public meeting in Clonmel last night on the housing, and a guy who worked in the local authorities in Tipperary in the 1970s got up and said, I was an engineer in here. He said, I built 300 houses in Tipperary, Clonmel town and Tipperary town. He said, 300 houses in Clonmel, 300 houses in Tipperary over 3 years. I built them 600 houses. So he said it's there. The thing is, the willingness is not there to do it, and it is back to the political willingness to do this is not there, and that's what has to change. And I think that ultimately we need another water movement. I think the housing.
Can we call it straight and say that Fine Gael are opposed to social housing on principle? They're just simply opposed to it on principle. I don't know if you can say that really, if it's on principle.
I think it's not just Fine Gael, because if we were talking before this, I was down speaking at because I've been banging on about this growing housing crisis.
And this is true. We were just talking about this maybe 4 years ago. We were down in Yalvin, in Elf, in the city centre. You were down there for SIP2, and you were telling people how bad it was then. And I was at this meeting. Of course, Bolshe me stood up and started saying, where's the solutions for now, for here? There's no point in telling people 5-10 years down the road you have a plan. Where's the solution for now? And I was getting quite Bolshe at SIP2, because SIP2 were back in Labour, and Labour were doing nothing. Nothing. It was a crisis then, and that was 4 years ago. Can't imagine how much worse it has gotten. We heard first-hand stories back then of county councillors letting people park their cars in their driveways so that they could sleep there safely in the cars.
And you have to extrapolate that. We think it's bad now. What is it going to be in 4 or 5 years' time? And my biggest fear is that we almost assume that there's a crisis. The government has to realise that surely they're going to do something. There's nothing. No evidence that they're actually going to change policy so to avoid this crisis getting worse. And that is my real fear. And that is why I think citizens have to stand up.
Yeah, well, I think what you're talking about is, and it's important, it actually carries us on to the next point and the next thing we really want to talk about. There's two mindsets here. There's one that Leo calls his vision for the Republic of Opportunity. And then, and that kind of fake libertarian mindset that I like to that bothers me terribly, that gives actual say social libertarians a bad name, and then there's the actual a Republic of Equality. That's something I know you're passionate about, Rory, so do you want to give me your thoughts?
What's the difference between a Republic of Opportunity and a Republic of Equality?
Well, I think that it is a starting point of how do you view our society and human beings. And essentially my vision of the Republic of Equality goes back to James Connolly, essentially, and that idea and the proclamation, and essentially I would call it a modern socialist perspective on human beings, which is that we're all born with potential. We're all born as equal human beings. Obviously we all have different talents, different skills, different abilities, and that our society, if it was set up in a way that could nurture all of that potential, that we wouldn't have these inequalities, and that it's the structure of society and our economy that creates this inequality. Whereas Varadkar sees it as we just need to create the opportunities, and essentially the fittest survive. They will do the best, and you give them the opportunity.
He's talking about an aspirational and a Victorian mindset of well,
it's basically if we give you the potential to get into university, well, it's up to you whether you get. He never recognises the deep inequality that's in our society from the moment you were born. You talked about that guard, what happened, that poor guard getting shot, and it made me think about and I worked for a long time in these communities that have been devastated by the drugs crisis, by poverty. Children born into those communities, children born into the emergency hostels. We have to remember, we have a third of our children in poverty, in deprivation.
Yes.
They're not born with an equal chance. No. Opportunities are going to be provided to them. So it's hollow. it's hollow, and what it is the idea of a meritocracy.
Yep.
This idea that if you work really hard, if you put in the best effort, then you will be rewarded for it.
Which is funny, because we know, like I've spoken about this at length and I've written about it as well, that we know the American dream that people talk about, that's dead, and this is the first generation that between 25 and 35-year-olds that are worse off than their parents are at that age. So what we're actually facing is a reduction in living standards being rebranded as a meritocracy.
Absolutely, and if you follow it through, essentially I would counterpose it between the models of Denmark, Sweden, the kind of Nordic social democratic models where you have, strong investment in public services, you have a general high taxation, really good economies, really very equal societies, social cohesion is much better, people are actually much happier, versus the Leo Varadkar, and it was Mary Hearne's, it was the PD's philosophy of the dream, of the American dream. You're absolutely right. What is the result of the American dream?
No, it's
inequality.
The most unequal country in all the wealthiest countries is the US. You have tent cities. You have people who are left dying on the streets because they don't have health insurance. That's the end point of a Republic of Opportunity, of Leo's Republic of Opportunity.
And there's some idea that we're in a process here of working towards a Republic of Opportunity. That seems to be Leo's idea. But we are actually that country with tent cities. We are actually that country where people are left to die on the side of the road. I mean, the scoliosis thing this week, that's just completely shocking.
Yeah. You look at like the scoliosis, you look at like people who are children with special needs, we look at people with mental health issues, we look at carers, we look at the disabled, we look at, as I said, the housing crisis, the health access to healthcare. This is a country that is deeply unequal, and the problem is Leo's vision and Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil's vision is a society that is only actually going to get more unequal. And I think I would come from an alternative perspective, which is abroad, well, you might call it social democratic, you might call it socialist. I prefer to call it actually just human values of social justice and equality. That is a society you're aiming for, but that requires very different policies, and so that's I suppose that's where we're trying to get.
Just want to come back in there, Rory, on something that's important to me, and I know it's important to you, and it's language. It's the language that's used in relation to both homelessness, housing, and in relation to Republic of Opportunity. A family hub would be a good example. Before Fine Gael came up with the idea of family hub, that phrase didn't exist in a lexicon. If you Google it, there is nothing prior to when Fine Gael came up with Family Hub. It was a marketeer's selling point to sell, for me, what are refugee camps for the internally displaced in the property wars. Now, I know when you
that doesn't flow, Martin.
when you said when you were brought up in the Dáil, you had said pretty much the same. That look, call them what you like, but these aren't family hubs. These are not family-friendly places. In fact, they're the exact opposite.
Yeah, no, and I think you are absolutely right, and it is something that we don't interrogate enough, and obviously Noam Chomsky talks a lot about it, is the role language plays in construction and in politics, and particularly on the left. People don't take it seriously enough that, really critiquing, and the media doesn't take it seriously enough. It doesn't critique, exactly. So Family Hub is a really good example of that. And there was a lecturer in Trinity, Paula Mayock, did some really good research where she actually took apart the notion of Family Hub, and there's a strong feminine connotation to Family Hub. It's like the idea of, it's the home, it's the heart, it's where the mother is seen with children, and yet here is a place that is the complete opposite. And as I said, some of them former Magdalene Laundries. This is an institutionalization, a punishing, a disciplining of the mother and the children. Of course, lone parents again. It's back to and
it is predominantly women with children. It is
predominantly women with children who are put in these, and some of them have historically their families were institutionalized.
That's right.
And they, as I've spoke to some of them who said that, they thought about that every day, where they were, what that was telling them, that it was your fault you were here, you have done bad things. And this is and the language Family Hub, of course, makes it seem all homely and nice when it is the complete opposite.
It's a refugee camp.
Well, it's in the terms of it's important that the conditions there are an improvement on hotels, but you have to understand that if you're putting 30 families who don't know each other together they can't share, for example, they can't mind each other's children. They don't know each other. They have to sign in and out. It is an institution. It's like direct provision in a way. And what we said is the danger is this will become the direct provision. These families will be left there. They will be forgotten. And
they come off the list, you see.
They exactly. They're no longer considered a priority. And we've essentially the government saying, and actually the minister said this recently, he said, down in Limerick, I met the housing official down there from the council, said they had a really bad housing crisis, but we have solutions now in family hubs and social housing. Suddenly family hubs are suddenly becoming a solution as a home.
A temporary feature that becomes permanent.
And there was the chair of the housing committee, the Fine Gael, Maria Bailey, and others have said, they're amazing and they're really good, the family hubs, and going, would you send your children there?
Well,
would you be happy with your children spending one day there? No, you wouldn't. It's because they're poor, it's because they're single mothers, and it's this othering, this victimisation, the blaming. It is their fault. It's not our society's fault.
Well, I mean,
it is not the decisions we have made to bring in vultures, to make property a commodity, to blame you, to stop building social housing. It's not that's fault. It's not the policy. It's your fault. And your problem.
Basically, what they're saying is, you got pregnant. Your fault.
Yeah, your fault. Yeah.
Yesterday, Dermot Lacey on Twitter pointed out that NAMA returned to profit before it should have. Dermot seemed to forget that when NAMA was actually set up overnight, one of the, I think it was the second principle, was that NAMA could act in the interests of the Irish people. It could have been a housing actual body from its inception. It's in the second page of its creation document. I've bloody read it. Yeah. So no, Dermot, you're wrong.
Well,
NAMA was to serve other people. And if I can just finish off on one point, and this is a real rant now at what's gone on in the mainstream media, what was being allowed to pass in terms of the language. Leo Varadkar 3 times repeated the line that communications is a virtue. It is simply not a virtue. Virtue is actually something that we have a value, that we have integrity, that we treat people with respect, we have dignity, we give people dignity, we do these things. Communication, he may as well said propaganda is a virtue, because that's what that sounded like. And for that to go unchecked, and for that to be accepted as a virtue, tells us everything we need to know about the mindset.
And we have to think really deeply, I think, about why have we such an absence of critical voices in Ireland? Why is there such an unwillingness to critique? And of course, you look at a critical voice like myself. The Taoiseach personally attacks me as a result of challenging policy, and as an academic. There's a huge lack of, for example, academics. In other countries, academics are seen as university lecturers. They engage in the public debate. There's a space for public intellectuals to critique mainstream policy. They're given voices in the media. In Ireland, it's not. It's really what I describe as an anti-intellectualism. Don't think big picture. Don't look long term. Don't critique the structures. Don't question. And of course, that is our historical legacy.
But isn't that what Damien English pretty much stood up and said? Look, don't make us look bad abroad.
Don't make us look bad abroad. Don't make us look bad in front of the big boys. Yeah. They mightn't allow us into their team. They mightn't allow us, share some of the sweets.
Who'd let Damien English into any fucking team, for God's sake?
But I think there's a lot of this. It's almost like we're the little boys in the big league, and it's the post-colonial thing. I think there's a real issue of our post-colonial situation, that we still want to be fucking oppressed.
But I think
we still want to prove to the colonizer we're actually really good. And there's something deeply wrong in that psyche. And I think what has happened though with the water movement is that there was a change. The people in most ordinary people in Ireland now are no longer shackled by the church. They're no longer shackled by the media, by the education system. They're thinking. People are a lot more educated. But what hasn't changed is the institutions of this state. The media, the government, local authorities, they are still stuck in that old conservative way of thinking. And we talk about this idea of an unfinished revolution. That in 1916 there was the revolution where people wanted, a social change. They wanted a republic of equality. But what happened after independence? The church came in, and we became almost a semi-fascist society, where there was no dissent, there was no questioning, there was no kind of critique. And I think in part we still have to have that revolution where we throw off all those cages that were put on us, and we actually become a mature society that really engages, that really discusses, that gets rid of the oppressive class that is destroying us and destroying our country, destroying our potential.
But I hear your call.
Tony's speaking for your president.
I fully accept. No, I agree with nearly all.
I can see him on the phone now. Get him out of here! Get him out of here quick! He's gone too far. Quick, press the eject button.
Tell those vulture funds I do love them. No. In all seriousness, I agree.
There go my shares. They're dropping. No.
What I need to see is where's the opposition that is unifying on the left? Where is that water movement for the greater good? Where is the ability of people within across the multitude of left-wing parties able to say, well, okay, we are different, we are unique, we're PBP, we're Solidarity, we're Sinn Féin, we're whatever it is. Can we agree?
Labour.
Can we agree? No, Labour are important as well, because Labour have
as the marker where you don't go.
I don't. You can say that all you want.
As the example of what not to do.
Yes,
you know,
absolutely.
as the guiding.
And
importantly for Sinn Féin, not to go into government and become another Labour Party and support. You know, sorry, you're going to finish.
No, I look at. The
bankers have to be defended. You know?
I look at T. Lawrence and I wonder about the pillars of wisdom, and I think to myself, going, where can we not just agree 4 bloody pillars on the left that all parties will agree?
You and I have discussed this before. We don't think that the left can cohesively get together as a grouping. But they can get together behind ideas.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely correct around that. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and I've been involved in movements, and also thinking intellectually and academically in terms of how does this social change come about. That if we look at what was the success of the water movement, the success of the water movement was people came together around an issue, a belief, and it was also representative of the inequality of austerity, the injustice of that. And ordinary people could take action, and they were empowered to take action, and communities led it. It wasn't any one of the parties. It wasn't even a left thing. It was a broad societal. It was cross-societal. Now, it was predominantly, working class communities that resisted those meters that were at the forefront of it, but it was a cross-societal movement. And if we need to take the lesson from that and go, the left absolutely has to fucking grow up and put aside the egos, put aside the history, work together. The most recent poll, or I think before today, but the one last week, I showed that if you put all those left parties together in the left independents, they had about 34% of the support. That is bigger than Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael individually, not combined, but they are a bigger bloc, but they're not presented as a united bloc, and it has to be around policies. That was what Right to Change was trying to do. It has a very interesting document that's worth reading, called the Principles and Policies, is Principles for a Progressive Government, and they go through the right to housing, right to education, right to health, democracy in Ireland, and I think that's where we need to move forward around. You're absolutely right. Let's get together around policies. The housing now is the other area where everybody who's really angry about this crisis, wants an alternative, can get together around alternative ideas and policies and push them. Because I do think that the danger is that the left, because of its division, is just going to squander this opportunity for change. And we could see Sinn Féin going into government with Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. I think that will be a mistake, because you're just a small party. Throughout Irish history, the left parties, when they've gone into government with the major Fianna Fáil, they've been devoured. They've ended up having to do things that they would never have done. I believe the strategy should be 2 things. You wait in opposition until you are in a position to be a majority. And that's what you do. And you use the parliament in opposition, which you can do now very effectively, to get policies forward. They can put forward, and you also then build what is called civil society. You build up the strength of social movements, NGOs, cooperative campaigns, democracies, alternative media. Because if you had a left government elected in Ireland today, I think that left government would be in big trouble. Because we haven't convinced people what these policies, alternative policies are, what it would do. We don't have a strong civil society yet that could defend that government against what will inevitably be, as we can see with Corbyn in the UK, the backlash from finance, from the wealthy, the attacks. You have to have a civil society that is behind that government, and I think that is the job of the left over the coming years.
We've missed that opportunity though since the last election, because we haven't even started this process. I know you talked Right to Change has started a process, but what I mean is, you've got a minority government that flounders about, can't do anything, and yet we can't get a coherent tyrant left to turn around
absolutely.
and actually keep pointing. Now, there's another reason they can't do it. It's because, well, the media kind of don't really want to. Large parts of the media don't want to knock down the government because they're hand in glove with them. Same with the corporatism or the clientism. So what you need to do is actually have, as you said, alternative media structures, alternative voices, and a physical document that you could circulate on social media, that you can circulate on distances. These are the four heads. These are what, as you said, housing, health, education, or whatever. But you will actually say these are
an economy based on investment rather than, do you know what I mean, just cuts and austerity.
I wrote yesterday about the fact that Ireland, in a recent study, is basically the most efficient tax haven in the world. We are effectively doing the rest of the EU, not the world, the rest of the EU out of 20 billion per year in taxes that they don't collect. And that would sound wonderful if we collected that money.
Exactly.
But we don't collect it.
We now have the lowest tax as a proportion of GDP tax stakes in the EU. We now have the lowest public spending as a proportion of GDP. So when people wonder why we have a health crisis, why we have a housing crisis, is because we don't invest in it. We don't invest in it because we don't take taxation, a fair taxation from our economy, from the wealthy. And the problem is that it's a vicious circle, that if you don't tax to invest, then you don't get a sustainable economy, you don't get the return.
Yes.
But just to finish, I think what for the next election, that the left should come together in a new right to change, put together 4 or 5 policies, present it to the people as an alternative to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and say, here, look, there is actual alternative, and it's about these policies.
Just yesterday, Pascal was on, I think was it Sean O'Rourke? It was Sean O'Rourke. And Pascal was saying that he's going to make it okay for people to work till 70 in the civil service. And in the same breath, he says Apple don't owe us 13 billion. One begets the other.
Exactly. Why do you?
If Apple don't pay that 13 billion, of course you have to work till 70 years of age, or else you can't afford a roof over your head. And Sean O'Rourke is sitting there listening to this, and I'm screaming at the radio. I'm saying, there it is. There's your opportunity. Go for it. Nail him. No. Nothing.
No, nothing. And it is important that the left parties sort of who've been elected, like Sinn Féin, Social Democrats, the Independents, People for Profit, they and obviously you've talked as well about here Claire Daly, Mick Wallace. They have actually made a very. It's important, like to say, I'm slating them for not getting together, but they have done a really important job, all of them, in raising these issues, in raising the whole idea of, and they were very good in the last election around the idea of we shouldn't have tax cuts, we should have public investment, around challenging around accountability. And I think that my worry is that again that this potential moment we have here where Ireland is really going through a crisis, because the irony, of course, we're in a recovery, yet we're in the deepest social crisis with housing, but also democracy, accountability than we've ever been. There is a crisis at the heart of our republic.
You always have to say about recovery that they will say there's a recovery. As long as FEMPI is in place, there is no recovery. You can't have an emergency and a recovery at the same time. You just can't.
You can't have more homeless people than you've ever had in your history and call it a recovery. You can't have child poverty rates.
It's a normalisation of austerity. And this was predicted 4 or 5 years ago, that austerity, we were never going to come out of austerity. They would simply normalise austerity. You have a very distinct two-tier society, those who are affected by it and those who are not affected by it.
And I think it's really important to say that a lot of this sometimes can leave you feeling a bit hopeless. That this is, it's getting bad, it's getting worse. But if we look at societies like, across the world, even as I mentioned, Sweden, Denmark, these are not, crazy socialist countries, but they're social democratic, they're capitalist countries, but they work a lot better. They have very different ways of doing things, and there's no reason why we can't, over time, become a better society. History is all about change. Change happens regardless of whether you want it to happen or not. The question is what type of change happens, and that is where I really think that there's a role for people if they get engaged, like you guys are doing around alternative media, which is absolutely fantastic, and as you said, vital. But people get involved in their community, get involved in a party, get involved in a trade union. Don't just sit at home. Do you know what I mean? Well, obviously you could sit at home, get on Twitter, get on Facebook, support, listen to the podcast, but actually engage.
Well, activism has to be part of it. I mean, we're both we both use social media quite a lot, but activism, if you're not an activist with that, you're just wasting your time. You have to do something with it. Showing your support is great, but you have to turn out to things. You have to turn up to things.
You do have to turn up, and you need to, and I think people need to realise that there's a real power in that. Like if you look at the water movement,
yes,
like what it achieved, it had the establishment. Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael were absolutely, they were on the rocks. They were terrified, and I do believe they are genuinely very worried that around the housing crisis there will be another movement like the water, and I think that is part of why they've gone on the attack to try and downplay growing solidarity, growing sense around of Irish people.
But they did with the water, and that's how they split the water. The first person to use the phrase "sinister fringe" was actually Leo. Leo came out and said it was a sinister fringe, and the connotations were, these are all subversives in here. Now, I was there with people who were solicitors. I was there with elderly people. This was a huge cross section of society. But immediately they started to blacken it, and they're doing the same now with homelessness. If you think homelessness is an emergency, there's something not normal about you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the people who are helping in the soup runs are actually doing more damage. And you're going, what? People who are going out, literally saving people's lives.
But how do you not solve a problem? You not solve a problem by putting people in charge who don't think the problem is solvable.
And who are actually actively trying to say there isn't a problem, of course, which should make us all terrified, and actually try and say, well, hang on a minute now. If they're saying there's not a problem, the problem must be really bad, and it is.
Yeah. The OECD report that I wrote about yesterday, that Pascal said proved we weren't a tax haven. That was a great case in point, because he stood up and he said, great news, the OECD said listed us as a fully compliant in our taxation policies, and we were the only, we were basically the top best boys at the table. And everybody said, everybody across the Irish Times, the Indo, they all said, this is great, we're not a tax haven. But they didn't look at the damn report. The damn report said we were a transparent tax haven. We were literally
back to language.
Back to language. They came out and they said, no, Ireland are the best tax haven, because we've a neon sign blinking over the country that says, come here, move, do your transfer pricing here, and we'll accommodate you. And not only we will accommodate you, we'll stand up to the OECD and say, there's our books, you can look at them, they're clean. They're not.
And there is something deeply disturbing about that we have built our economy on basically, I'll use it very strongly, but taking other people's money in that sense. It is a form of like kind of neo-colonialism in a way.
No. They're standing on the beach with lanterns and they're bringing the ships onto the rocks. That's
exactly. But it's deeply, it's also deeply unstable or unsustainable. It's built on sand. As if the US changes its tax base, when Europe harmonises tax bases, and we suddenly don't start getting this investment in, what have we done?
I put a solution on the piece yesterday. There's an easy solution. You want to end transfer pricing in the morning. Tell the people, go and say, you can only transfer pricing where the taxes are paid where the jobs are. Yeah. So if there's 10,000 jobs in Germany and 5,000 in Ireland, and you want to shift your profits to Ireland, you can only shift half of them, because you've only got half your workforce there, boys and girls. So unless we get the jobs, you don't get the benefit. And all of a sudden it becomes a more... I know you're going to mock me, but it becomes more egalitarian in a free market sense, that you actually have that. And why wouldn't people move their jobs here? Because we are the best tax haven in the world. We're the most transparent one. So you would move your jobs here, which would then, in effect, actually help build a sustainable economy of actually based on jobs, not based on brass plates.
Absolutely. And I think it also reflects a lack of confidence in the Irish people, in our ability to develop, an economy that's like, there's so many areas that so much social enterprise is happening around, that people are developing all sorts of ideas around environmental technologies, even around, caring, healthcare ideas, around like in the universities, in all across the country, people are developing ideas around, developing the economy. But the problem is the government doesn't support those. It's all about the foreign investment, get the foreign investment in. That's and they neglect this huge potential. And of course, part of the issue with the housing crisis now is they've caught themselves in a huge contradictory position, that now they're trying to get investment in, but they don't have housing for the workers.
Just and again, I suppose I'd like to start bringing this towards the end and understand that. Well, there is an event on Tuesday. It is a home for all. It's going to be songs and words. There's some great people there. We've actually delighted to say that Erica Fleming was
our old pal Erica,
our first ever guest and a friend of the pod, as we like to say.
Get yourself done up there, Erica. We'll be in to see you.
An awful man, Martin. An awful man.
Erica,
you're very lucky. What he was about to say now, I held him back. I constrained him. No.
I can't even edit out some of the stuff. No, listen, Rory, you're going to be there as well. You're deeply involved in this from the outset. There's movements like the Gaelic Players for Change movement as well. That's recently kind of raised the profile as well, which I was really delighted to see people like Dermot Ling and Eamon Fennell, who, it's great to see people putting themselves out there.
Yeah, and Eamon's going to be speaking as well at the event. Yeah, Glenn Hansard is playing. There's lots of other.
Try to get Glenn to stop playing.
Exactly. Yeah, Terry McMahon is going to be doing some strong words. There's a number: Emmett Kerwin, Sarah Clancy, lots of poets. And the idea behind it was to, it was pulled together quite quickly in response to this sort of, I suppose, what you call attack. What I describe as attack on the homeless crisis, the housing crisis by various bods in the state, and really to give, the idea was to get music artists, give ordinary people, civil society, a chance to say, look, we're saying this crisis isn't normal, and actually what's happening is the housing crisis is affecting everybody. It affects everybody now, and we need to come together to say to the politicians at all, you have to solve this. We're not allowing you just get away with saying it's not normal. So it's 12 o'clock outside the Dáil. It'll be going on for a few hours. Really, we try and encourage people to get along. Obviously, the more people are there, the stronger it shows the sense to politics and the government. But come along, listen to the music, listen to the words.
That's 12 on Tuesday.
Yeah, and so the other thing I just wanted to say really briefly, the other idea around it is the idea of a right to a home, a human right to a home.
Yes.
And there's a bit of controversy around this. And we were talking that there is no right to housing in the Constitution. There's a right to private property, which has been used by landlords, for example, as their reason to justify they can evict people into homelessness, and it has also been used as a reason why the government say we can't put in place stronger tenant protections or control rents, and really it's time for that to change. Housing should be guided by the fundamental thing: it is a home for people, it's a place where families can feel secure, where they can grow up, and you need to have it defined as a human right in the Constitution.
Paddy Cullivan said it very well on this podcast a few weeks ago. He said on this little island of ours, with the small population that we have compared to, say, big cities like Manchester or London, and we've all the natural resources dripping out of us. I know the Department of Agriculture and the like have a report for 2020 that the state can produce enough food to feed 50 million mouths, and yet we have child poverty, going to school hungry. So I suppose this touches on why we're going to be solution focused on these podcasts for the next while. We're talking about people here who are getting together. We're gonna try and trash these things out, and we have academics like yourself. We're gonna people like Lorcan Sir talk about housing, and it's great to see voices like Erica coming to the forefront, and it's great to see people from across the, as you say, civil society, artists, poets, musicians. Even if Glenn just keeps wants to busk. No, we love you, Glenn. He's from up the road. He's okay.
But I think as well it's important, that we do. Varadkar thinks he's, Mr. Cool. We have to show the coolness. Actually, the coolness will come from doing something about the housing crisis, and being cool is being at the protest.
Oh, come on, that's cool.
That's cool. Yeah. I grew up in the 1980s, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I know.
Cool. Does people use the word cool anymore?
Varadkar to me now is just like so uncool. It's just like so square. He's so square.
All you wear is beanies. What would you know?
Yeah, but there's a coolness to being like hobo chic. But anyway, what I wanted to say
was... too old for being cool now, Martin. Not too old for being cool.
27 years of age. There's plenty of time left. What I wanted to say was, for Tuesday, we ran a poll a couple of weeks ago on is homelessness an emergency, or is it normal?
You and Tony is not a poll.
We stuck it out there on Twitter. It was our biggest response that we got to any poll we put up. 97% of people said it's an emergency.
Yeah.
So people do know this is an emergency. So please, get up off your ass. Go to this thing on Tuesday. Turn around to Leo. Say, Leo, it's not hip to be
You can tell your children you did it. Tell your children you were there. You were part of the change.
Yeah, you were there. You were on the front line fighting the neoliberals.
You guys got anything else before we wrap up?
No.
Okay, I just want to say again, finally, Tuesday's rolling, guys. I want to thank you all for listening. I want to remind you that you just can subscribe to us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or wherever you get your podcast from. Please take a minute, leave us a review, and don't forget to tell your friends. Keep an eye on our website, echochamberpod.com, to find all our previous podcasts and some new blogs.
Oh yeah, Tony put up a blog that's it's not that he didn't mention it at all through this, but he did put up a new blog.
Martin has on his Twitter feed that he is a blogger, but I don't think he's ever written anything.
I blog from the heart, Tony, from the heart.
Send us an email at echochamberpod@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at echochamberspod. Thanks again, folks. Thanks, Rory, for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me. We remember the revolution started here.
Yeah. See you, folks.